The cabin groaned under the weight of snow like an animal slowly dying. Lianzhou pressed her palm against the frost-coated window, feeling the cold bite through her skin. Outside, the world had disappeared. Not gradually, the way things usually fade in winter, but violently, all at once, as if someone had thrown a white sheet over existence itself and walked away. The blizzard had come down 3 days ago. 3 days of wind that screamed like something wounded. 3 days of snow that didn't fall so much as attack, horizontal and vicious, erasing the barn, the fence posts, the path to the well. Everything beyond 10 feet might as well have stopped existing. Inside, the silence was worse than the storm. Lian turned from the window and looked at her children, huddled together on the single mattress they all shared now. Mei, the oldest at 9, had her arms wrapped around 6-year-old June. The twins, Hua and Feng, barely 4, were pressed against each other like puppies seeking warmth. Their breath made small clouds in the frigid air. They were still asleep. That was a mercy. Because when they woke up, they'd be hungry. And she had nothing to give them. The pot hanging over the dead fire was empty. Had been empty since yesterday morning when she'd scraped out the last of the corn mush and divided it between 4 bowls, pretending she'd already eaten. The flour sack held maybe 2 cups of weevil-infested grain. The strips of dried venison her husband had put up last fall, back when there was still a husband, still a future. Those had run out a week ago. She'd checked the root cellar at dawn. 4 shriveled potatoes, each one barely bigger than her fist, sprouted and soft. That was it. That was everything standing between her children and starvation. Lian walked to the fireplace and knelt in front of it, even though the stones radiated nothing but cold. The last piece of firewood had gone into the stove 2 nights ago. Since then, she'd been burning furniture. The spare chair first, then the small table Wei had built when Mei was born. She'd had to break it apart with the axe, and every crack of splitting wood felt like breaking bones. Last night, she'd fed the fire with the bed frame from the room that used to be theirs, Wei's and hers. Now, there was nothing left but the mattress the children slept on and the larger table they ate at. After that, it would be the door. The walls, the cabin itself, consumed piece by piece to buy them 1 more hour of warmth. She stared at the ash pile, gray and lifeless. Outside, the wind hit the cabin in a sustained blast that made the whole structure shudder. Snow forced itself through cracks in the walls she'd tried to plug with rags and newspaper. The temperature inside couldn't be much above freezing. "Mama?" Lian's head snapped around. Mei was awake, sitting up on the mattress, her dark eyes too large in her thin face. The girl had her father's eyes, deep brown, almost black, and far too knowing for 9 years old. "I'm here, baby." Lian forced her voice to stay steady. Normal, as if everything was fine. "Is it Christmas yet?" The question hit like a fist. Christmas. Right. It was December 25th. She'd been so consumed with the immediate crisis of survival, food, warmth, the next hour, the next breath, that she'd almost forgotten what day it was. "Yes," she said quietly. "It's Christmas morning." Mei looked around the bare cabin, at the dead fireplace, at the empty pot. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. Understanding, maybe. Or the death of whatever small hope she'd been carrying. "Are we going to church?" Mei asked. Lian almost laughed. It came out as something between a cough and a sob. Church. The white clapboard building in the settlement, 3 miles down the frozen road they hadn't been able to navigate in weeks. The place where families gathered in their wool coats and polished boots, where children wore ribbons in their hair and sang hymns about peace on earth. Where the women had stopped meeting Lian's eyes 6 months ago, after Wei died. Where the men had made it clear, without ever saying it directly, that a Chinese widow with 4 mouths to feed wasn't their problem. "No, sweetheart," Lian said. "The storm's too bad. We're staying home." Mei nodded, accepting this. Then, "Is Papa coming back today?" This was the question that gutted her every time. Because Mei knew. She'd been there when they buried Wei in September, when the first frost was already turning the grass silver. She'd stood at the grave while Lian had tried to explain that Papa was gone, that he wasn't coming back, that it was just them now. But knowing and accepting were different countries, and Mei kept crossing back and forth between them. "No, baby," Lian said, her throat tight. "Papa's not coming back." Mei stared at her for a long moment. Then she lay back down and pulled the threadbare blanket over her shoulders, turning away. Lian stood there useless, her hands empty. The wind screamed. Guam. By mid-morning, all 4 children were awake and trying not to cry about being hungry. Leon had boiled the 4 potatoes into a thin soup, stretching it with the last of the grain and some snow she'd melted in the pot. It tasted like poverty, starchy and bland with grit at the bottom, but it was hot, and the children drank it without complaint. June finished his bowl and looked up at her with those heartbreaking eyes. "Can I have more?" "Let it settle first," Leon said, taking the bowl from his hands before he could see that the pot was already empty. "See how you feel in a little while." He nodded, believing her, and went back to the corner where he and Feng were building a fort out of bundled rags. May sat at the table, watching Lian with that unsettling awareness. "There's no more, is there?" May said quietly. Lian met her daughter's eyes. For a second, she considered lying, keeping up the pretense. But May deserved better than that. "No," Lian admitted. "There's no more." May absorbed this. "What are we going to do?" "I don't know yet." It was the truth. And it was terrifying. 3 miles to the settlement. In good weather, an easy walk. But the snow was hip-deep in places, the wind strong enough to knock a grown woman off her feet. Even if Lion could make it, even if she didn't freeze to death on the way, what would she find? Doors closed in her face, polite refusals, the kind of charity that came with shame attached, that made you feel like you were stealing even as they handed it over? She'd tried that already. Back in October, when the money ran out and the first snows came early, she'd swallowed her pride and gone to the settlement store. She'd asked Mr. Pritchard for credit, just enough to get through the winter. He'd looked at her like she was something he'd scraped off his boot. "Can't extend credit to someone with no way to pay it back, Mrs. Zhou," he'd said, loud enough for the other customers to hear. "That's just poor business." She'd left without arguing. What was the point? He was right. She had nothing. Wei's death had left them with a half section of drought-ruined land and debts she couldn't even calculate. No crops, no livestock except the chickens, and those had been taken by a fox in November. No skills the settlement valued, no connections, no leverage. Just 4 children and a will to survive that was cracking under the weight of winter. Lian stood and walked to the window again, staring out at the white chaos. Somewhere out there, beyond the storm, people were celebrating, singing, opening presents, eating until they were full, complaining about the weather like it was an inconvenience instead of a death sentence. And here, in this cabin that smelled like cold ash and desperation, her children were slowly starving. She pressed her forehead against the frozen glass and closed her eyes. "What do I do? What the hell do I do?" The afternoon dragged on with the kind of slowness that felt like punishment. The twins started crying around 2 o'clock, not loud, dramatic crying, but the quiet, exhausted kind that came from bodies running on empty. Lian held them both, rocking back and forth, humming a song her own mother had sung to her a lifetime ago, in a country that felt like a dream now. June sat in the corner, too tired to play. May had retreated into silence, staring at the wall with an expression that made Lian want to scream. This was what defeat looked like. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a slow grinding down of hope until there was nothing left but the shape of where it used to be. Lian looked at the door. She could try to make it to the settlement. Right now. Before dark. Leave the children here with blankets and the last bit of warmth in the cabin and just go. Fight her way through the storm, beg, plead, throw herself at the mercy of people who had already made it clear they had none to spare. It was a terrible plan. It was also the only plan she had. She was about to stand up, about to actually do it, when a sound cut through the wind. At first she thought she'd imagined it. The storm played tricks, made you hear things that weren't there. But then it came again. The creak of wheels, the low sound of a horse blowing hard through its nostrils. Lian's head snapped toward the door. May heard it too. "Mama, there's someone outside." Lian stood slowly, her heart suddenly hammering. No one traveled in weather like this. No one sane, anyway. Which meant whoever was out there was either desperate or dangerous, or both. She moved to the window and wiped away the frost with her sleeve, peering out into the swirling white. At first she saw nothing. Then the storm shifted just for a second and a shape emerged from the chaos. A wagon, a single horse, massive and dark, pulling a flatbed loaded with something covered in canvas, and driving it, sitting up on the bench like the weather was nothing more than a mild annoyance, was a man. Lian's breath caught. She recognized him immediately, even through the storm. Everyone in the settlement knew Caleb Rourke, though few had ever spoken to him. He lived alone on a ranch 10 miles north, came into town maybe once a month for supplies, and made it clear through sheer force of silence that he had no interest in human company. He was a big man, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of build that came from years of hard labor. His face was weathered, all sharp angles and permanent sun damage, and his eyes were the pale gray of winter sky. He wore a battered coat and a wide-brimmed hat that somehow stayed on his head despite the wind, and he was driving straight toward her cabin. Leanne stepped back from the window, her mind racing. What the hell was he doing here? They'd never spoken. Not once. She'd seen him in town, sure, hard to miss a man like that, but he'd never acknowledged her existence, never given any indication he even knew she was alive. So why was he here? Now? In the middle of a blizzard? The wagon stopped about 20 feet from the cabin door. Caleb climbed down, moving with the deliberate economy of someone who didn't waste energy. He walked to the back of the wagon, pulled back the canvas, and started unloading. Leanne watched, frozen, as he made trip after trip through the snow. A sack of grain, a bundle of firewood, a haunch of meat wrapped in cloth, another sack, this one smaller, but heavy. More wood. A crate of something she couldn't identify. He stacked it all just outside the door, methodical and efficient, not hurrying despite the storm. When he was done, he straightened up, looked directly at the cabin at the window where Leanne stood watching, and touched the brim of his hat. Then he climbed back onto the wagon and drove away into the white. Leanne stood there, her mind struggling to process what she'd just seen. May appeared at her elbow. "Mama, what was that?" Leanne didn't answer. She walked to the door, pulled it open, and stepped out into the cold. The supplies were real, not a hallucination, not a dream. She knelt in the snow and opened the first sack. Flour. Good quality, not the cheap stuff. Enough to last weeks. The meat was venison, freshly butchered. The smaller sack held cornmeal and beans. The crate had potatoes, carrots, and onions. Actual vegetables, firm and real. And the firewood. God, the firewood. Split oak, dry and ready to burn. Enough to keep the stove going for days. Leanne sank down onto her heels, staring at the pile of supplies like it might disappear if she looked away. This didn't make sense. Why would Caleb Rourke, a man who went out of his way to avoid human contact, risk his life in a blizzard to bring food to a family he didn't know? What did he want in return? Because nothing came for free. Leanne had learned that lesson the hard way. Everything had a cost, especially kindness, especially from men. Her hands were shaking. She should be grateful. She was grateful. This food would save her children's lives, but gratitude was tangled up with suspicion, with the sick certainty that she'd just taken on a debt she didn't understand and couldn't repay. "Mama, you're getting covered in snow," May said from the doorway. Leanne looked down. The girl was right. Her knees were soaked through and flakes were accumulating on her shoulders. She stood up, grabbed the sack of flour, and carried it inside. Then she went back for the rest. That night the cabin was warm for the first time in weeks. Leanne had built a fire in the stove, a real fire, not the pathetic smoldering embers she'd been nursing along, and the heat filled the small space like a blessing. She'd hung the haunch of venison from a hook near the ceiling to keep it from spoiling and cooked a pot of stew with potatoes, carrots, and chunks of meat that made the children's eyes go wide. They ate until they were full, actually full. June ate 2 bowls and then lay down on the mattress with his hand on his stomach, groaning happily. The twins fell asleep mid-bite, their faces still sticky with stew. Even May smiled. Leanne cleaned the pot and put the leftovers in the coldest corner of the cabin, already thinking about tomorrow's meals. Planning. Like she had a future again. But underneath the relief was a knot of anxiety she couldn't untangle. She kept seeing Caleb Rourke in her mind. The way he'd moved through the storm like it was nothing. The way he'd unloaded the supplies without a word, without waiting for thanks or explanation. The way he'd looked at the cabin, at her, with those pale gray eyes before driving away. What did he want? Men didn't do things like this without a reason. Her father had taught her that. Way had confirmed it. Every interaction she'd had in this country had reinforced it. Kindness was a transaction. Generosity was a down payment. Gifts came with strings attached, and the strings were always invisible until it was too late. So what was the string here? Leanne sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of weak tea she'd made from melted snow and the last of the dried herbs. The cabin was quiet except for the pop and hiss of the fire. She should sleep. The children were safe and fed, the cabin was warm, and tomorrow's problems could wait for tomorrow. But sleep felt impossible. Instead, she stared into the fire and tried to figure out what she owed Caleb Rourke and what he'd come to collect. 3 days passed before he came back. The storm broke on the second day, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow buried everything: the fences, the woodpile, the path to the outhouse. Drifts reached the cabin's eaves in places. The sky was hard and blue, the kind of cold that made your lungs ache. Leanne spent those days rationing the supplies, trying to make them last as long as possible. She cooked simple meals: stew, porridge, bread made from the flour, and baked in the stove. The children's energy returned. Their cheeks filled out. June started playing again instead of sitting quietly in the corner. But every time Leanne looked at the dwindling pile of firewood, the knot in her chest tightened. This wasn't permanent. It was a reprieve. And reprieves always ended. On the third day, she was outside splitting wood, trying to extend the supply, even though her arms ached and her hands were blistered, when she heard the wagon. She straightened up, the axe still in her hands, and watched as Caleb Rourke drove up the snow-packed trail. He stopped the wagon and climbed down, same deliberate movements as before. This time, though, he didn't start unloading. He walked straight toward her. Leanne's grip tightened on the axe handle. Not out of fear, exactly, but caution, wariness. The recognition that whatever was about to happen, it would define the terms of whatever debt she'd incurred. Caleb stopped about 6 feet away. Up close, he was even bigger than she'd realized. Not fat, there wasn't an ounce of softness on him, but solid. Built like someone who'd spent his whole life wrestling with stubborn animals and unforgiving land. His face was hard to read. Not cold exactly, just absent. Like he'd gotten so used to being alone that expressions had stopped being necessary. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and rough, like he didn't use it often. "Mr. Rourke." Leanne kept her own voice steady, neutral. He looked at the pile of wood she'd been working on, then at her blistered hands, then back at her face. "You're wasting effort," he said bluntly. "That wood's half green, won't burn worth a damn." Leanne felt her jaw tighten. "It's what I have." "Not anymore." He turned and walked back to the wagon, pulled out another load of split oak, and carried it to her woodpile. She followed him. "Mr. Rourke, I need to know what you expect in return for this." He set the wood down and straightened up, looking at her with those unsettling pale eyes. "Expect? For the food, the firewood, all of it? What do you want?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Nothing." "I don't believe you. Don't care if you believe me or not, it's the truth." Leanne's hands clenched. "People don't do this for nothing. There's always a cost." Caleb's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "You think I'm here to collect something from you. Aren't you?" "No." "Then why?" "Because letting children starve while I've got food rotting in my cellar is stupidity," he said flatly. "That's it. That's the whole reason." Leanne stared at him, trying to find the lie. The angle, the hidden motive. She couldn't. Either he was the best liar she'd ever met, or he was telling the truth. And the truth was somehow more disturbing than any lie could be. "I don't need charity," she said. "Didn't offer charity. Offered food. You want to call it something else? That's your business. I can't pay you back." "Didn't ask you to." "Then what?" "Ma'am." He cut her off, his voice still level, but with an edge of impatience now. "I've got work to do. You can stand here arguing about nothing, or you can let me unload this wagon and get back to it. Your choice." Leanne opened her mouth, closed it. He was right. What the hell was she doing? Her children were warm and fed because of him, and she was out here trying to pick a fight over the terms of a debt that apparently didn't exist. "Fine," she said finally. "Unload the wagon." He gave a short nod and went back to work. Leanne watched him for a minute, then set down the axe and went to help. They worked in silence, carrying supplies into the cabin. More firewood, another sack of grain, dried beans, salt pork, a jar of honey that made the twins squeal when they saw it. The children watched Caleb with a mixture of curiosity and caution. May, especially. She stood in the corner, her dark eyes tracking his every movement like she was trying to solve a puzzle. When the wagon was empty, Caleb straightened up and looked around the cabin. His gaze swept over the thin walls, the gaps where snow had gotten in, the broken window they'd patched with oiled paper. "This place won't make it through January," he said. Leanne bristled. "It's held this long." "Barely." He walked over to the wall and pressed his hand against it. The wood flexed under his palm. These supports are rotted. You get another big storm. The roof's coming down. I'll reinforce it. With what? He looked at her. You don't have tools. You don't have materials. And even if you did, you don't have the strength to do the work. It should have sounded like an insult, but he said it the same way he said everything, blunt and factual, like he was commenting on the weather. And he wasn't wrong. Lien looked around the cabin, seeing it through his eyes. The sagging ceiling, the cracked floorboards, the stove that worked but barely, the chimney that leaked smoke. This wasn't a home. It was a box they'd been surviving in, and it was falling apart. What do you suggest I do? She asked, hating how defeated she sounded. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll come back tomorrow. Fix what I can. You don't? Yeah, I do. He cut her off. Like I said, letting people freeze because I'm too lazy to patch a roof is stupidity. He walked to the door, then paused and looked back at her. You got an axe? Yes. Keep it sharp and keep it close. This far out, you never know what's coming. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft thump. Lien stood in the warm cabin, surrounded by food and firewood and the smell of wood smoke, and tried to understand what had just happened. May appeared at her side. I like him, she said quietly. Lien looked down at her daughter. Why? He doesn't lie. Out of the mouths of children. Lien walked to the window and watched Caleb's wagon disappear down the trail, swallowed by the white landscape. He doesn't lie. Maybe that was true. Maybe Caleb Rourke was exactly what he appeared to be. A blunt, practical man who saw a problem and fixed it because leaving it unfixed offended his sense of order. Or maybe he was something else entirely. Either way, Lien realized with a strange mixture of relief and dread she was about to find out. Because he was coming back tomorrow. And the day after that. And the day after that. Whether she wanted him to or not. Caleb showed up the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Lien heard the wagon first. That same creaking rhythm, the horse's heavy breathing cutting through the frozen air. She was already awake, had been for hours, sitting at the table with a cup of tea going cold in her hands. Sleep had been impossible. Every time she'd closed her eyes, her mind had spun through the same questions on an endless loop. What did he really want? What was she missing? When would the other shoe drop? She stood and moved to the window, watching as he climbed down from the wagon with that same unhurried efficiency. This time, the flatbed was loaded with lumber, tools, and what looked like rolls of tar paper. The children were still asleep, bundled together on the mattress like a litter of kittens. Lien grabbed her coat and stepped outside before he could knock and wake them. The cold hit her like a wall. Her breath came out in white clouds that hung in the still air. The snow crunched under her boots as she walked toward him. Caleb was already unloading, pulling boards off the wagon and stacking them in the snow. He glanced up when she approached, but didn't stop working. Morning, he said. You're early. Daylight's short this time of year. Need to make use of it. Lien crossed her arms, partly against the cold, partly because she didn't know what to do with her hands. You're really going to fix the roof? Said I would. Why? He set down the board he was carrying and straightened up, looking at her with those pale eyes that gave away nothing. You want me to leave? Just say so. I'll pack up and go. I didn't say that. Then what are you saying? Lien struggled to put it into words. I'm saying I don't understand you. I don't understand why you're doing this, and I don't know what you expect from me in return, and that makes me nervous. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled off his gloves and shoved them in his coat pocket. You want the truth? Yes. I don't expect anything from you. I'm doing this because that cabin's about to collapse, and I've got the tools and materials to fix it. That's the whole reason. There's no hidden angle, no strings. I'm not trying to get anything from you except maybe to stand there and hold the ladder when I need it. That's it? That's it. Lien studied his face, looking for cracks in the story. But his expression was the same as always, flat, neutral, unreadable. Either he was being honest or he was so good at lying that she'd never spot it. Fine, she said finally. I'll hold the ladder. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. Appreciate it. He turned back to the wagon and grabbed a toolbox, then looked at her again. You had breakfast yet? No. Kids? They're still sleeping. Then wake them up and feed them. I'll start work on the roof. Come out when you're ready. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact, delivered in that same blunt way he said everything. Leanne found herself nodding before she'd consciously decided to agree. She went back inside and started a fire in the stove, then began cooking porridge with some of the grain he'd brought. The smell woke the children one by one. June stumbled over to the table, rubbing his eyes. The twins emerged from the blankets like small animals leaving a burrow. May sat up and immediately looked toward the window. "Is that man back?" she asked. "His name is Mr. Rourke," Leanne said. "And yes, he's here to fix the roof. Can I watch?" "After you eat." They sat down to bowls of hot porridge sweetened with a little of the honey. Leanne ate standing up, her eyes drawn repeatedly to the window where she could see Caleb moving around outside, setting up a ladder against the side of the cabin. When they'd finished eating, May went to the door and pressed her face against the gap, watching him work. June joined her. Even the twins seemed curious, though they were too small to see much. Leanne cleaned up the breakfast dishes, then put on her coat and went back outside. Caleb was on the roof now, moving carefully across the snow-covered shingles. He'd already pulled up several boards and was examining the underlying structure with a critical eye. "Worse than I thought," he called down. "Whole northwest corner's rotted through. You're lucky it hasn't caved in already." "Lucky," Leanne repeated flatly. He glanced down at her. "Could be worse. Could be dead. That's the definition of lucky in my book." He wasn't wrong. She'd spent the last few months feeling like the unluckiest person alive, but standing here in the cold morning air, warm and fed with a stranger repairing her roof, she had to admit he had a point. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "For now, nothing. I'll call if I need the ladder steadied." Leanne stood there for a moment, feeling useless. Then she noticed the pile of old shingles and rotten boards he'd pulled off the roof. They were scattered in the snow, making a mess. She started gathering them up, stacking the salvageable pieces in one pile and the trash in another. It wasn't much, but it was something. Movement, purpose. Better than standing around watching him work. They fell into a rhythm after that. He'd pull off damaged sections, toss them down, and she'd sort through the debris. Occasionally he'd call down a question about where something was or how long it had been like that, and she'd answer. The conversation was minimal, practical, stripped of anything unnecessary. It reminded her of working with Wei in the early days, before the drought, before everything fell apart. They'd had a rhythm too, a way of moving around each other without getting in the way, of communicating with looks and gestures instead of words. The memory hit her harder than she expected. She had to stop for a moment, her hands full of broken shingles, and just breathe through it. When she looked up, Caleb was watching her from the roof. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. He just went back to work. By midday, he'd replaced most of the damaged boards on the northwest corner and was starting to lay down new tar paper. The sun was high and bright, reflecting off the snow in a way that made everything look sharp and clean. Leanne's fingers were numb despite her gloves, and her back ached from bending over to pick up debris. "Take a break," Caleb called down. "Get inside and warm up." "I'm fine." "Didn't ask if you were fine, told you to take a break." Leanne bristled at the tone. "I don't take orders from you." "No, you don't. But you do take common sense, and common sense says you've been out here for 3 hours in below freezing temperatures. Go inside before you get frostbite." He was right, and that made it worse. Leanne wanted to argue just for the sake of arguing, but her hands were shaking from the cold, and she could barely feel her toes. "Fine," she said, and hated how petulant she sounded. She went inside where the children were playing a game with stones and bits of string. The cabin was warm from the fire, and the heat felt like a physical thing pressing against her frozen skin. She made herself another cup of tea and sat at the table, trying to stop shivering. May appeared at her elbow. "Is he nice?" "Who, Mr. Rourke?" "Yes." Leanne thought about it. "I don't know, he's different." "Different how?" "He doesn't talk much. And when he does, he just says what he means. No dancing around things." May considered this. "I think that's nice. People talk too much anyway." Out of the mouths of children, again. Leanne sipped her tea and watched through the window as Caleb continued working on the roof. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent his whole life doing physical labor, every movement economical and precise. No wasted effort, no hesitation. She wondered what his story was. Why he lived alone on a ranch 10 miles from the nearest neighbor. Why he'd never married. Why he'd chosen isolation in a place that punished loneliness. But those were questions she had no right to ask, just like he had no right to ask about Wei, about why she'd stayed in this falling-apart cabin instead of going back to her family in California, about what it felt like to watch everything you'd built crumble in the span of a single season. Some stories were private. Some pain didn't need to be shared. After about 20 minutes, Lian went back outside. Caleb was down from the roof now, packing up his tools. Finished? She asked. For today. Got the worst of it patched. I'll come back in a few days and finish the rest, but it'll hold for now. Thank you. He nodded, not quite meeting her eyes. You should check the inside. Make sure there's no water damage from where it was leaking. They went into the cabin together. Caleb had to duck slightly to get through the door. The frame was built for someone shorter. He stood in the small space, looking around with that same critical assessment he'd given the exterior. The children stared at him with wide eyes. June had actually backed up a step when Caleb entered, intimidated by his sheer size. You're big, Feng said, because 4-year-olds had no filter. Feng, Lian snapped, but Caleb's expression softened slightly. Yeah, I am. Makes it easier to reach high shelves. Feng giggled. Caleb walked over to the northwest corner and examined the ceiling. You had any water coming through here? Not recently, Lian said, but last month there was a leak. I put a bucket under it. He ran his hand along the ceiling boards, feeling for soft spots. Well, you shouldn't have that problem anymore. If it does start leaking again, let me know. How am I supposed to let you know? I don't even know where you live. 10 miles north, following the river. Ranch is the only structure for 5 miles in any direction. Can't miss it. That's a long way to travel just to tell you about a leak. Then don't travel. I'll be back in a few days anyway. He said it casually, like it was already decided, like his presence here had become part of the routine. Lian didn't know how to feel about that. Caleb finished his inspection and headed back toward the door. Then he paused and looked at May, who was still watching him with that intense, analytical stare. You keep an eye on things while I'm gone, he said to her. May straightened up, clearly taking the responsibility seriously. I will. He gave her a small nod, then looked at Lian. I'll bring more firewood next time. You're going through it faster than I thought. You don't have to. Yeah, I do, unless you want to go back to burning furniture. He left before she could respond, pulling the door shut behind him. Lian stood in the warm cabin, surrounded by her children, and tried to figure out what had just happened to her carefully maintained walls. The next few days fell into a strange new pattern. Caleb would show up every morning with supplies or materials, work on some aspect of the cabin that needed fixing, and leave before dark. He reinforced the walls, replaced the broken window with actual glass, fixed the stove so it drew properly, instead of leaking smoke into the cabin. He even built a small covered area next to the door where they could store firewood so it stayed dry. He didn't talk much while he worked, but Lian found herself talking to him anyway. Small things at first, comments about the weather, questions about how to do basic repairs, observations about the children, and slowly, carefully, he started talking back. She learned that he'd grown up on the ranch where he still lived, that his father had died 5 years ago, leaving him the land and the livestock and nothing else, that he'd never been married, never even come close, because most women took one look at the isolation and ran in the other direction. Can't blame them, he said one afternoon while fixing a crack in the foundation. It's not an easy life out here. No, Lian agreed. It's not. He glanced at her. Your husband. How long's he been gone? Since September. How'd it happen? Lian hesitated. She hadn't talked about this with anyone. Not the people in the settlement who'd turned their backs on her. Not the children who were too young to understand. Not even herself, really. She'd locked it away in a part of her mind she didn't visit. But something about Caleb's directness made lying feel impossible. Accident, she said finally. He was trying to dig a new well. The drought had dried up our water source, and he thought if he went deeper, he'd find it. The walls weren't properly shored up. They collapsed on him. Caleb was quiet for a moment. You try to dig him out? Yes, for hours, until my hands were bloody and I couldn't lift the shovel anymore. But there was too much earth, too much weight. Her voice cracked. By the time I got help from the settlement, it was too late. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry. But sorry doesn't bring him back. Sorry doesn't fix the fact that he died trying to save a piece of land that wasn't worth saving. Caleb set down his tools and looked at her directly. Land's always worth saving if you're willing to work for it. Not this land. The drought killed it. Nothing grows here anymore. Drought's temporary. Land remembers water. It'll come back. You sound certain. I've seen it before. Drought of '86 lasted 3 years. Everyone said the land was dead, but the rains came back, and so did the grass. Just takes time. Lian wanted to believe him, but belief felt dangerous. Hope had failed her too many times. Maybe, she said. They worked in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence, not uncomfortable, just present. That night, after the children were asleep, Leon sat at the table and thought about the last 2 weeks, about how much had changed. The cabin was warmer, sturdier, more like an actual home than a shelter. The children were healthy and fed, and she no longer woke up in the middle of the night paralyzed by fear of what tomorrow would bring. All because of a stranger who'd shown up in a blizzard with no explanation and no apparent agenda beyond basic human decency. It didn't make sense, but maybe it didn't have to. The days grew longer, or maybe they just felt longer because there was more to do. Caleb brought seeds one morning, winter wheat, he said, that could be planted early and would grow even in cold soil. He showed Leon where to plant them and how deep, treating her like a student instead of someone helpless. "You'll need to tend them," he said. "Keep the birds off until they're established." "I know how to tend crops," Leon said, a little sharply. "Didn't say you didn't, just making sure you know these are different from what you're used to." He was right, of course. The crops she'd grown in California were nothing like what survived here. Different soil, different weather, different rules. She was tired of learning new rules, but she planted the wheat anyway, because what else was she going to do? Sit inside and wait for spring? Wait for the settlement to suddenly decide they cared? Wait for another disaster to finish what winter had started? No, she was done waiting. May helped with the planting, her small hands carefully pushing seeds into the cold earth. June tried to help too, but mostly he just scattered seeds randomly and then got distracted by a rabbit he saw near the tree line. The twins stayed inside with strict instructions not to touch the stove. Caleb watched them work for a while, then went back to whatever project he was tackling that day. He'd moved on from the cabin itself to the outbuildings, fixing the barn door that had blown off its hinges, reinforcing the chicken coop even though there were no chickens anymore. "Why fix it if we don't have chickens?" Leon asked. "You'll get chickens eventually. Better to have it ready." "I can't afford chickens." "Didn't say you had to buy them. I've got extras. I'll bring some over." Caleb, "What?" She didn't know what to say. Every time she tried to draw a line, to establish boundaries, he just stepped over them like they weren't there. Not aggressively, just factually. Like the boundaries made no sense, so why acknowledge them? "Nothing," she said finally. He went back to work on the chicken coop. That afternoon, while the children were playing in the snow, Leon found herself standing next to Caleb as he hammered new boards into place. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Why are you really doing this?" He didn't stop working. "Told you already?" "I know what you told me, but there's got to be more to it than just not wanting food to go to waste." Caleb set down the hammer and looked at her. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, "You want the truth?" "Yes. I've been alone for 5 years. 5 years of waking up to an empty house, eating meals by myself, going weeks without talking to another person. And I told myself that was fine, that I preferred it that way, that people were too much trouble and I was better off without them." He paused, picking up a nail and examining it like it was the most interesting thing in the world. "But watching you try to survive out here with 4 kids and no help, I don't know. It made me angry, not at you, at everyone else, at the people in that settlement who turned their backs because you're different, at the way the world just lets people fall through the cracks and pretends it's their own fault." "So this is about anger?" "No, it's about being tired of being alone and realizing that maybe I don't have to be." The honesty of it hit Leon like a punch. She'd been expecting a different answer, something noble or selfless, some story about how he'd been helped once and was paying it forward. But this was rawer than that, more human. "I'm not asking you to fix my loneliness," he continued. "I'm just saying that helping you helps me too. Makes me feel like maybe I'm not completely useless." Leon didn't know what to say to that. Every response that came to mind felt inadequate. So instead, she picked up a board and handed it to him. "You're not useless." He took the board, and something that might have been a smile crossed his face. "Appreciate that." They worked together until the sun started to set, turning the snow orange and pink. When they finished, the chicken coop looked almost new, sturdy, ready. "I'll bring those chickens tomorrow," Caleb said, packing up his tools. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." He climbed onto the wagon and picked up the reins, then looked back at her. "You're doing good, Leon. Better than you think." It was the first time he'd used her first name. The sound of it in his rough voice did something strange to her chest. "So are you," she said quietly. He nodded, then drove away into the fading light. Leon stood there in the cold, watching until the wagon disappeared. Then she went inside where the children were already settling down for the night. May looked up from the book Caleb had brought her, an old copy of fairy tales, worn but readable. "Mama, is Mr. Rourke going to stay?" "Stay? Like, live here? With us?" Leon's heart did something complicated. "No, baby. He has his own home. But he's here every day. He's helping us fix things, that's all." May looked unconvinced but didn't argue. She went back to her book and Leon started preparing dinner. But the question stayed with her. Was this temporary? Would Caleb eventually finish all the repairs and stop coming? Would they go back to being alone, except now she'd know what it felt like to have help? To have company? The thought made her chest tight. She told herself it didn't matter, that she couldn't start depending on him, that the moment she let herself believe he'd always be there was the moment everything would fall apart. But late that night, lying on the mattress with her children tucked against her, she let herself imagine it. Just for a moment. What it would be like if he stayed. If the rhythm they'd fallen into became permanent instead of temporary. The thought terrified her. And somewhere underneath the terror, something else stirred. Something she'd buried along with Way. Something that felt dangerously like hope. The next morning, Caleb arrived with a crate of chickens in the back of the wagon. 6 hens, rust-colored and loud, clucking indignantly at being transported. The children were thrilled. June immediately wanted to name them all. The twins tried to pet them and got pecked for their trouble. Even May smiled, watching the birds strut around their newly repaired coop like they owned the place. Caleb showed Leon how to feed them, how to collect eggs, how to keep predators away. He'd brought feed too, enough to last until spring. "This is too much," Leon said. "Chickens eat. That's what they do. Feed's not expensive." "That's not what I meant." He looked at her. "I know what you meant." They stood there in the cold morning air, the children's laughter echoing from the coop, and something unspoken passed between them. Leon broke first. "Stay for breakfast." Caleb hesitated. "I should get back." "One meal won't kill you, and the kids would like it." "The kids? Fine. I'd like it." He studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right." They went inside where the cabin was warm and smelled like fresh bread. Leon had been up early using some of the flour to make something more substantial than porridge. The loaf was still warm from the oven, and she cut thick slices and served them with butter and honey. Caleb sat at the table, carefully, like he was afraid he might break something, and accepted the plate she handed him. The children sat down too, quieter than usual. They were watching him the way they might watch a wild animal that had wandered into camp. Curious, but cautious. "You can eat," Leon told them. They dug in. Caleb ate slowly, methodically, like someone who'd spent most of his life eating alone and had forgotten what it was like to share a meal. "This is good bread," he said after a few bites. "Thank you." "You make it from scratch?" "Yes, my mother taught me." "She's still in California?" "She died when I was 16. "Sorry. It was a long time ago." They ate in silence for a while. Then June, who'd been gathering courage, spoke up. "Mr. Rourke?" Caleb looked at him. "Yeah? Do you have kids?" "June," Leon said sharply. But Caleb shook his head. "It's fine. No, I don't have kids." "Why not?" "June, that's enough," Leon said. "Never met anyone who wanted to have kids with me," Caleb said simply. "And I'm not the kind of man who'd make a good father anyway." "Why not?" June persisted. "June, I don't talk much. I work too hard. And I live too far from anywhere civilized. Kids need more than that." May, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. "I think you'd be a good father." Everyone looked at her. "You fix things," she continued, "and you don't lie. And you showed up when we needed help. That's what fathers do." Caleb looked like he'd been hit with a board. He opened his mouth, closed it, then looked down at his plate. Leon's throat was tight. "May, finish your breakfast." But the damage was done. Or maybe it wasn't damage at all. Maybe it was something else, something true that needed to be said. They finished eating without much more conversation. When they were done, Caleb stood and carried his plate to the basin. "I should go," he said. "All right." He headed for the door, then paused. "Leanne?" "Yes?" Thank you. For breakfast. And for... He trailed off, seemingly unable to find the words. I know, she said softly. He nodded and left. Leanne watched through the window as he climbed onto the wagon and drove away. The children had already scattered, June to check on the chickens, the twins to play in the snow, May to her corner with her book. And Leanne stood alone in the warm cabin, her hands shaking slightly, wondering what the hell she was doing. Because this wasn't just about survival anymore. It hadn't been for a while, and she had no idea what to do about that. 3 weeks passed before Lion realized she was waiting for him every morning. She'd wake up before dawn, start the fire, put the kettle on, and then find herself drawn to the window, watching the horizon, listening for the creak of wagon wheels, telling herself it was just routine, just habit, nothing more than that. But it was more than that. She knew it, and the knowing sat in her chest like a stone. Caleb still came most days, though the repairs were done now. The cabin was solid, the outbuildings functional, the chicken coop producing eggs regularly. There wasn't much left to fix, but he kept finding reasons to show up. A fence post that needed replacing, a drainage ditch that should be dug before the spring thaw. Small things that could have waited, but didn't. And Leanne kept finding reasons to need him there. It was dangerous. She knew that too. This growing dependency, this shift from survival partnership to something she didn't have a name for yet. Wei had been dead less than 6 months. She should still be grieving, should still be focused entirely on keeping her children alive and nothing else. But grief didn't work on a schedule, and loneliness didn't wait for permission. One morning in late January, Caleb arrived with his wagon loaded differently than usual. Instead of tools or supplies, there were bundles of what looked like dried plants in a large wooden crate. Leanne met him outside, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "What's all this?" "Medicine," he said, climbing down. "And herbs for cooking. Figured you might need them." He carried the crate inside while Leanne followed, curious. The children looked up from their breakfast as he set it on the table and opened the lid. Inside were glass jars filled with dried leaves, roots, and powders. Labels written in careful handwriting. Willow bark, chamomile, yarrow, sage, thyme, mint. "My mother kept these," Caleb said, pulling out one of the jars. "Taught me which ones to use for what. This here," he held up the willow bark, "works for fever and pain. Boil it into a tea. Tastes like hell, but it works." Leanne picked up the chamomile jar, turning it in her hands. The dried flowers were still fragrant. "Your mother was a healer?" "Of sorts. Mostly, she just knew how to keep people alive when the nearest doctor was 3 days' ride away." He set the jar back in the crate. "I've got more than I need. Figured you should have some." "Caleb, I can't... We doing this again?" He looked at her with that flat expression that meant he wasn't budging. "The argument where you tell me it's too much and I tell you it's practical and we waste 10 minutes before you accept it anyway?" May giggled from the table. Leanne felt her face heat. "I just don't want you to think..." "I don't think anything except that having medicine on hand when you've got 4 kids is common sense. That's it. That's all it is." But his eyes said something different, something neither of them was ready to put into words yet. "Thank you," Lion said quietly. He nodded and turned his attention to the children. "You kids know how to ride a horse?" June's eyes went wide. "No." "Want to learn?" All 4 of them started talking at once, excitement overriding their usual shyness around him. Caleb held up a hand for quiet. "One at a time. And only if your ma says it's all right." They all turned to look at Leanne with pleading eyes. Even May, who usually maintained her dignity, looked hopeful. Leanne wanted to say no. Wanted to maintain some kind of boundary, some line between Caleb's help and her children's lives. But looking at their faces, at the first real joy she'd seen in months, she couldn't do it. "All right," she said, "but you listen to Mr. Rourke. And if he says you're done, you're done." The children rushed outside, bundled in their coats and scarves. Caleb followed more slowly, and Leanne trailed behind, telling herself she was just supervising. His horse was a massive bay gelding named Sam, patient and steady despite the children's excited energy. Caleb lifted June up first, settling him on the saddle and showing him how to hold the reins. "Don't pull. He'll think you want him to stop. Just hold them loose, like this." June nodded seriously, gripping the leather with intense concentration. Caleb led the horse in a slow circle around the yard, and June's face split into a grin so wide it made Leanne's chest ache. Each child got a turn. Feng nearly fell off and had to be caught. Hua squealed with delight the entire time. Even May, who was usually reserved, laughed when Sam tossed his head and snorted. Watching them, Leon felt something crack open inside her. Some part she'd kept locked down tight since Wei died. Because these moments of simple happiness, of childhood joy, this was what she'd been fighting for all along. Not just survival, not just staying alive, but actually living. When all the children had ridden, Caleb led Sam back to the wagon and started unhitching him from the harness. "What are you doing?" Leon asked. "Leaving him here for a few days." "What? Why?" "Because you need a horse, and I've got 3. Sam's the calmest. The kids can practice riding, and you can use him if you need to get to the settlement." "Caleb, I can't take your horse." "Not taking, borrowing. I'll be back for him in a week." "That's not... You can't just..." She struggled for words. "How will you get home?" "I'll walk. It's 10 miles. I've done worse." "In this weather?" "Weather's clear. I'll be fine." He finished unhitching Sam and tied him to the fence post. "There's feed in the barn. Give him a scoop morning and night. Make sure he's got water. Kids can brush him if they want." "Caleb." He turned to face her, and something in his expression made her stop mid-sentence. "Let me do this," he said quietly. "Please." It wasn't a demand, it was a request, raw and honest in a way that made her defenses crumble. "All right," she whispered. He nodded, shouldered his pack, and started walking north without another word. Leon stood there watching him go, a tall figure in a dark coat trudging through the snow, getting smaller with distance. The children were already swarming around Sam, petting his nose and feeding him bits of carrot, and Leon realized with absolute certainty that she was in serious trouble, because somewhere in the last few weeks Caleb Rourke had stopped being a stranger helping them survive. He'd become something else entirely. That night, after the children were asleep, Lion sat at the table with the crate of herbs open in front of her. She picked up each jar, reading the labels, remembering Caleb's rough hands holding them as he explained their uses. She thought about his mother, about a woman who'd lived out here in the isolation, who'd learned to heal because she had to, who'd raised a son alone after his father died. There was a story there, pain and loss and survival that mirrored her own. Maybe that's why Caleb understood, because he'd lived it too. The next few days were strange. Good strange, but strange nonetheless. Having the horse changed things. The children took turns riding Sam around the property, gaining confidence with each circuit. Leon used him to haul firewood from the tree line, a task that had been nearly impossible on foot. The work felt lighter somehow, more manageable. But Caleb's absence was louder than his presence had been. Lion caught herself looking toward the horizon constantly, expecting to see his wagon. The cabin felt too quiet without the sound of his hammer or saw. Dinner felt wrong without setting an extra place at the table on the days he'd stayed. She told herself it was fine, that she'd gotten too used to having help, that's all. That once he came back for Sam, things would return to normal. Except normal had shifted, and she wasn't sure she wanted it back. On the 4th day, May came to her with a question that made Leon's stomach drop. "Mama, do you like Mr. Rourke?" They were collecting eggs from the chicken coop, the morning sun just starting to warm the frozen ground. Leon fumbled the egg she was holding and nearly dropped it. "What kind of question is that?" "The kind that has an answer." May looked at her with those 2 knowing eyes. "Do you?" Leon carefully placed the egg in the basket and bought herself time by checking the next nesting box. "He's been very helpful to us." "That's not what I asked." May, "Papa's been gone for a long time," May said quietly. "And you're lonely. I can tell." Leon's throat went tight. "Baby, that's not something you need to worry about." "I'm not worried. I'm just asking." Lynn sat back on her heels and looked at her daughter. Really looked at her. When had May gotten so old? When had she stopped being a little girl and turned into this perceptive, thoughtful person who asked questions Leanne didn't know how to answer? "It's complicated," Leon said finally. "Because of Papa. Because of a lot of things. Because I don't know Mr. Rourke very well. Because we have to be careful. Because..." She stopped, not sure how to explain the rest. The fear, the guilt, the strange pull toward a man who'd shown up in a blizzard and quietly rearranged her entire world. "I think he likes you too," May said. "What makes you say that?" "The way he looks at you when you're not paying attention, like you're a puzzle he's trying to figure out." Leon's heart did something complicated. "You're too young to be noticing things like that." "I'm 9. That's not too young for anything." It should have been funny, but Leanne couldn't find the humor, because May was right, and the truth of it terrified her. They finished collecting eggs in silence and went back inside. The rest of the day passed in routine tasks: cooking, cleaning, mending clothes, teaching the younger kids their letters. But Leanne's mind kept circling back to the conversation. The way he looks at you when you're not paying attention. Was that true? And if it was, what did it mean? What did she want it to mean? That night, lying in the dark with the children breathing softly around her, Leanne let herself think about it. Really think about it. She'd loved Wei. Still loved him, in the way you love someone who's gone. But their marriage hadn't been perfect. They'd been young when they met, broke when they married, desperate when they came west. Love had been tangled up with survival from the start. And toward the end, before the accident, things had been hard. The drought had worn them both down, made them sharp with each other, turned their partnership into something strained and difficult. She'd been grieving that marriage as much as the man himself. But Caleb was different. He didn't need her, didn't want anything from her except maybe her company. He showed up because he chose to, not because he was obligated. And that choice, that daily decision to help without expectation, felt more solid than any promise Wei had ever made. It wasn't fair to compare them. Wei had done his best, had loved her in the only way he knew how. But he was gone, and she was still here. And at some point she had to decide if she was going to spend the rest of her life holding onto a memory or building something new. The question was whether she was brave enough to try. Caleb came back on the 7th day, right when he'd said he would. Leanne heard the wagon before she saw it and felt her pulse kick up in a way that had nothing to do with surprise. She was outside hanging laundry that had frozen stiff in the cold air, and she made herself finish pinning the sheet before she turned around. He looked the same, coat covered in trail dust, hat pulled low, face unreadable. But when he saw her, something shifted in his expression. Relief, maybe, or something close to it. "Morning," he said, climbing down from the wagon. "Morning. How was the walk home?" Long, cold, uneventful. He looked past her toward the barn. "How's Sam?" "Good. The kids have been riding him every day. I think they're going to be heartbroken when you take him back. Don't have to take him back right away. Can leave him here a while longer if you want." "That would just make it harder when he eventually leaves." Caleb met her eyes, and for a second she wasn't sure they were still talking about the horse. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I suppose it would." The children came running out then, shouting greetings and dragging Caleb toward the barn to show him how much better they'd gotten at riding. Leanne watched them go, her chest tight with something she couldn't name. Later, after he'd admired their progress and helped June with his seat position, Caleb came to find her where she was working in the storage shed, organizing the diminishing supplies. "Need help?" he asked. "Just counting what we have left. Trying to figure out how long it'll last." He stepped into the small space, which immediately felt smaller with him in it. "How's it looking?" "Better than it would have been without you. We'll make it to spring, assuming nothing goes wrong." "Things always go wrong. That's why you plan for them." "Is that your philosophy? Plan for disaster?" "Hasn't failed me yet." Leanne turned to face him and realized he was standing closer than she'd thought. Close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his dark hair at the temples, the scar on his jaw she'd never noticed before. "Caleb," she said, and then stopped, not sure what she wanted to say. "Yeah? Why do you really keep coming back? And don't tell me it's about the horse or finding work to do. Tell me the truth." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. Then, "You want the truth?" "Yes. I keep coming back because I don't want to be at my ranch anymore. Because it's empty and cold and I'm tired of eating alone. Because your kids make me laugh and you make me think, and this place feels more like home than anywhere I've been in 5 years." He paused. "That honest enough for you?" Leanne's breath caught. "Caleb, I'm not asking for anything," he continued. "I know you're not ready for that. Might never be ready, and that's fine. I wanted you to know, so you're not wondering." "I have been wondering," she admitted, "about a lot of things." "Like what?" "Like what happens when spring comes and you don't have any more reasons to fix things. Like whether you'll stop coming. Like whether I want you to stop coming." The words came out in a rush before she could stop them. "Like what it means that I look for you every morning and feel disappointed when you're not there." Something changed in Caleb's face. Not quite a smile, but close. "That's so? Don't make fun of me." "Not making fun. Just glad I'm not the only one feeling it." They stood there in the cramped shed, surrounded by sacks of grain and winter supplies, and the air between them felt charged with possibility. Leon knew she should step back, should put distance between them, should remember that she was a widow with 4 children and no business starting something with a man she barely knew. But she didn't step back. Instead, she said, "I'm scared." Of what? Of this. Of letting someone in again, of trusting it and then losing it. I can't. Her voice cracked. I can't survive losing someone else. Caleb reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. His palm was rough and warm, calloused from years of hard work. "I can't promise you won't lose me," he said. "Accidents happen. People die. That's life out here. But I can promise I won't leave by choice. And I can promise I'll do everything in my power to stay alive, because now I've got a reason to." "That's not enough." "I know it's not, but it's all I've got." Leon looked down at their joined hands, her mind racing. This was insane. Too fast. Too soon. Too risky. Every logical part of her brain was screaming at her to stop, to protect herself, to not do this. But she was so tired of being scared, so tired of being alone, so tired of surviving instead of living. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay? I don't know what this is. I don't know what it's going to be. But, okay, we can try." Caleb's hand tightened around hers. "You sure?" "No. But I'm doing it anyway." This time he did smile, small and genuine. "That's the bravest thing I've heard in a long time." They stood there for another moment, hands linked, before the sound of the children calling for Caleb broke the spell. He let go of her hand and stepped back, and the world returned to normal. Or what passed for normal now. "Better see what they want," he said. "Yeah." But neither of them moved right away. They just looked at each other, acknowledging what had just happened, what had just been decided. Then Caleb turned and walked out of the shed, leaving Leon alone with her racing heart and the terrifying knowledge that she'd just agreed to something she didn't fully understand. The next 2 weeks brought a shift in the weather. The brutal cold eased slightly, though snow still covered everything. The days grew incrementally longer, and Caleb started coming earlier and staying later, until it became routine for him to share dinner with them most nights. The children adjusted to his presence with remarkable speed. June started following him around, asking endless questions about horses and ranching and how things worked. The twins treated him like a piece of furniture, present and useful, but not particularly special. May watched everything with her quiet intensity, clearly trying to figure out the new dynamics. And Leon was trying to figure it out too. It was strange, having a man in the house again. Strange in good ways and difficult ways. She'd gotten used to making all the decisions herself, to the absolute control that came with being alone. Now she had to navigate Caleb's opinions, his way of doing things, his presence in her space. They disagreed sometimes about how to handle June's stubborn streak, about whether to plant the garden early or wait, about money. He'd offered to pay off some of Way's debts, and she'd refused so vehemently they'd barely spoken for a day. But they also laughed, found rhythms, developed a shorthand that came from spending time together, and slowly, carefully, they started to build something that felt like trust. One evening in mid-February, after the children were asleep, they sat at the table with cups of tea and the comfortable silence that had become familiar. "Can I ask you something?" Leon said. "Sure." "Why didn't you ever marry? You said women didn't want the isolation, but that can't be the whole story." Caleb was quiet for a moment, staring into his tea. "I was engaged once, long time ago. Sarah Whitmore, prettiest girl in 3 counties. What happened? She came out to see the ranch, spent 3 days there. On the 4th day, she got back on the stage and went home. Sent me a letter a week later breaking it off." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Said she couldn't live somewhere that quiet, that it made her feel like she was disappearing. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." She was right. It does make you disappear if you're not careful. You wake up one day and realize you haven't spoken to anyone in a week, haven't seen another human being, haven't done anything except work and sleep and exist. He looked at Leon. "That's why I started coming here, really, because I could feel myself fading. And you reminded me what it felt like to be real." Leon didn't know what to say to that. The honesty of it was overwhelming. "I'm glad you came," she said finally. "Even though I fought it, even though I didn't trust it, I'm glad." "Me too." They sat in silence for a while longer. Then Caleb stood and reached for his coat. "I should go. It's late." "You could stay." The words were out before she'd fully thought them through. Caleb froze, his coat halfway on. Leanne, not like that, she said quickly, feeling her face heat. I just meant, it's a long ride back in the dark, and we have the space. You could sleep by the fire. It would be safer. He studied her face. You sure? Yes. All right then. He took off his coat and laid it over the back of the chair. Leanne found him a blanket and pillow, and they set up a makeshift bed near the stove where it would stay warm. Thank you, he said. It's practical, that's all. But they both knew it was more than that. It was another line crossed, another step towards something neither of them could take back. That night, Leon lay awake for a long time, listening to Caleb's breathing from across the room. It was strange having him there. Strange but not uncomfortable, like a piece of furniture that had been missing finally sliding into place. She thought about Wei, about the guilt she still carried, about whether it was too soon, too fast, too selfish to want this. But the guilt was quieter now, softer, because Wei would have wanted her to survive, would have wanted the children cared for, would have understood that survival sometimes meant letting go and moving forward. At least she hoped he would. The next morning, Caleb woke early and helped her make breakfast. The children came stumbling out to find him there, and accepted it without question, like he'd always been part of their mornings. And maybe, Leon thought, he had been, just waiting in the wings for them all to be ready. After breakfast, Caleb didn't leave. Instead, he stayed through the day, working on small projects around the property. And when evening came, Leon didn't ask if he was staying. She just set an extra place at the table and made up his bed by the fire. It became a pattern. Days blending into each other, Caleb's presence becoming less like a visitor and more like family. They didn't talk about what it meant, didn't label it or try to define it. They just lived it. But Leanne knew they couldn't hide in their little world forever. Eventually, they'd have to face the settlement, face the judgment and the questions and the hostility she'd worked so hard to avoid. And when that happened, everything they'd built would be tested. She just hoped it was strong enough to survive. The decision to go into town came 3 weeks later, and it wasn't really a decision at all. They'd run out of salt. Not the kind of thing you could do without, not when you were preserving meat and curing hides and trying to make food last through what remained of winter. Caleb had offered to go alone, but Leanne had surprised herself by saying no. I'll come with you, she'd said. It's time. He'd looked at her carefully. You sure about that? No, but I'm going anyway. So on a Saturday morning in early March, with the snow finally starting to melt and the air holding the first hint of spring, they loaded the wagon. Leon dressed the children in their best clothes, which weren't much, but they were clean and mended. She put on the one decent dress she owned, dark blue wool that had belonged to Wei's mother, and braided her hair tightly against her skull. Caleb wore clean trousers and a shirt that didn't have any visible repairs. He'd even shaved, his jaw sharp and exposed in a way that made Leanne's stomach do strange things. You look nice, she said without thinking. He glanced at her, something that might have been embarrassment crossing his face. So do you. The children piled into the back of the wagon, excited, despite not fully understanding why this trip felt different from all the ones that hadn't happened over the winter. May sat close to Leon on the bench seat, her small hand finding her mother's and squeezing once. The ride to the settlement took about an hour. The road was muddy from the thaw, and the wagon's wheels carved deep ruts in the soft ground. They passed other homesteads, most of them dark and shuttered, families who'd either left for the winter or simply given up entirely. As they got closer to town, Leanne felt her chest tighten. The last time she'd been here, it had been for Wei's funeral. Before that, it had been those failed attempts to buy supplies on credit, to find work, to get any kind of help at all. Every memory associated with this place was bad. We don't have to do this, Caleb said quietly, reading her tension. Can turn around right now if you want. No, I'm tired of hiding. This isn't hiding, it's protecting yourself. From what? Whispers, stares? I've survived worse than gossip. He didn't argue, but his jaw was tight as they rolled into the settlement's main street. The town of Stillwater was small, maybe 300 people when everyone was counted. One main street with a general store, a church, a saloon, a boarding house, and a handful of other businesses. Houses clustered around it like chickens around feed, most of them simple structures not much better than Leon's cabin. It was Saturday, which meant people were out. Farmers buying supplies, women doing their weekly shopping, children running between buildings, their voices high and bright in the cold air, and every single one of them stopped to stare when Caleb's wagon rolled past. Leanne felt the weight of their eyes like physical things. She kept her own gaze forward, her spine straight, refusing to look away or show weakness. Beside her, May had gone very still. Caleb pulled the wagon up in front of Pritchard's general store and set the brake. Want me to go in alone? No, we'll go together. They climbed down, and Leanne helped the children out of the back. June immediately wanted to run off and explore, but she kept a firm hand on his shoulder. Stay close, she said. All of you. The store's door had a bell that rang when they entered. Inside, it smelled like coffee and sawdust, and the slightly musty scent of fabric that had been sitting too long on shelves. Mr. Pritchard was behind the counter, a heavy-set man with thinning hair and a permanent scowl. He looked up when they entered, and his expression went from neutral to hostile in the space of a heartbeat. Mrs. Joe, he said, his voice flat. Been a while. Mr. Pritchard. Leanne kept her voice steady. I need salt. 20 pounds if you have it. I have it. Question is whether you can pay for it. I can pay. She pulled out the small leather pouch where she'd been keeping the money from selling eggs. It wasn't much, barely enough to cover the salt and maybe a few other necessities, but it was honest money. Earned money. Pritchard's eyes flicked from the pouch to Caleb, who was standing slightly behind Leanne, his presence solid and unmistakable. Rourke, Pritchard said. Didn't expect to see you in here with the Joe woman. Just helping a neighbor, Caleb said evenly. That a problem? Neighbors help each other out here and there. This looks like something else. Does it? Caleb's voice was mild, but there was steel underneath it. And what exactly does it look like to you, Pritchard? The store owner's face reddened. I'm just saying, people talk. And when a man spends that much time at a widow's cabin, folks are going to draw conclusions. Let them draw whatever conclusions they want. Doesn't change the fact that Mrs. Joe needs salt and has money to pay for it. So how about you do your job and sell it to her? The tension in the store was thick enough to cut. The other customers, two women Leanne vaguely recognized and an older man she didn't, had stopped their shopping to watch the confrontation. Pritchard stared at Caleb for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Then he turned to the back room without a word and returned with a burlap sack of salt, which he thunked onto the counter hard enough to make the children jump. 20 pounds, $4. It was highway robbery. Salt shouldn't cost more than $2. But arguing would just draw out the confrontation. Leanne counted out the coins and slid them across the counter. Pritchard took them without comment and made change with deliberate slowness. When he finally handed over the remaining coins, his fingers didn't quite touch hers. Anything else? He asked. No, thank you. They left the store, Caleb carrying the salt, Leanne herding the children ahead of her. The bell rang behind them like a verdict. Outside, more people had gathered, not openly staring, but positioned in ways that made it clear they were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Lynn recognized some of them. Mrs. Henderson, who'd brought a casserole after Way died, and then never spoken to her again. The Swenson brothers, who'd helped dig Way's grave. Ellen Marsh, who'd been almost friendly once before the isolation had set in. None of them acknowledged her now. They were loading the salt into the wagon when a voice cut across the street. Well, if it isn't the China woman. Leanne turned slowly. Thomas Garrett stood in front of the saloon, flanked by two of his friends. He was maybe 25, the son of one of the more prosperous ranchers in the area, and he'd made his dislike of Leanne clear from the moment she'd arrived in Stillwater. Garrett, Caleb said, his voice low and warning. Move along. This is a public street, Rourke. I can stand where I want. Garrett's eyes were on Leanne, looking her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. Heard you've been keeping company with this one. That true? Not your business. It is when it affects the community. We got standards here, values. He took a step closer, and one of those values is that white men don't consort with... He didn't get to finish the sentence. Caleb moved faster than Leanne had ever seen him move, crossing the distance between them in 3 strides and grabbing Garrett by the front of his shirt. You finish that sentence, Caleb said quietly, and I will break your jaw. Are we clear? Garrett's friends tensed, hands moving toward their belts. The street had gone silent. Even the children had stopped making noise. Caleb, Leanne said, let him go. Not until he apologizes. I don't need his apology, and this isn't worth it. Caleb's jaw worked, but he released Garrett and stepped back. Garrett stumbled, catching himself against the saloon's wall, his face red with anger and humiliation. This isn't over, Garrett said. Yes, it is, Caleb replied. Because if you or anyone else bothers Mrs. Joe or her children, you'll answer to me. And trust me when I say you don't want that." He turned and walked back to the wagon where Leon was already lifting the children into the back. His hands were shaking slightly, from anger or adrenaline, she couldn't tell. They climbed onto the bench seat and Caleb took up the reins. But before he could signal the horses to move, another voice called out, "Mrs. Joe, a word, please?" Leon turned to see Reverend Matthews approaching from the direction of the church. He was an older man, gray-haired and soft-spoken, one of the few people in Stillwater who'd shown her any kindness after Way died. "Reverend," she said cautiously, "I just wanted to say—" He paused, glancing at the watching crowd, then back at her. "I wanted to say that you and your children are always welcome at services, should you choose to attend." It was a small thing, a simple statement, but in the context of everything that had just happened, it felt like defiance. "Thank you," Leon said quietly. "I'll consider it." He nodded and stepped back, and Caleb clicked his tongue at the horses. The wagon lurched forward, carrying them away from the settlement and back toward the relative safety of isolation. No one spoke for the first mile. Then June said, in a small voice, "Mama, why was that man so mean?" Leon closed her eyes briefly. "Because some people are afraid of what they don't understand, and fear makes them cruel." "Is he afraid of you?" "Of me being different?" "Yes." "That's stupid." "Yes, baby, it is." Caleb's hands were tight on the reins, his knuckles white. Leon reached over and touched his arm gently. "Thank you," she said, "for what you did back there. Almost made it worse. But you didn't. You defended us. That matters. Garrett's not going to forget this." "I know." They rode in silence for a while longer. Then May spoke up from the back of the wagon. "Are we going to go back? To the settlement?" Leon looked at Caleb, then back at her daughter. "I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not. Does it matter?" "I don't like it there," May said. "People are mean." "Not all of them. The Reverend was kind. One person out of a whole town isn't enough." Out of the mouths of children, striking truth like always. When they got back to the cabin, Caleb helped unload the salt and then stood by the wagon, clearly preparing to leave. "You're going home?" Leon asked. "Figured I should. Give you some space after all that." "I don't want space." He looked at her. "Leon, stay. Please. The children need—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I need you to stay." Something shifted in his expression. "You sure?" "Yes." So he stayed. And that night, after the children were asleep, they sat at the table and talked about what had happened. About Garrett's threats. About the settlement's hostility. About whether it was worth trying to be part of a community that clearly didn't want them. "We could leave," Caleb said. "Go somewhere else, start over." "Where?" "Every settlement is going to be the same, and I can't afford to start over. This land, terrible as it is, it's all I have." "Not all you have." She looked at him. "Caleb, marry me." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and terrifying and somehow inevitable all at once. Leon's mouth went dry. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated. "Combine our properties, pool our resources. Make it official so there's no question about my presence here, no fuel for gossip." "That's not a reason to get married." "It's one reason. Not the only one." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I know it's fast. I know you're still grieving. I know this isn't some romantic fairy tale, but it's practical, and it would protect you and the kids, give you legal standing, make things easier." "Easier for who?" "For everyone." Leon pulled her hand back, her mind racing. "You're asking me to marry you for practical reasons. I'm asking you to marry me because I don't want to leave, because I want to be part of this family, because the thought of going back to that empty ranch and spending the rest of my life alone makes me want to put a gun in my mouth." He stopped, seeming to realize how dark that sounded. "Sorry, that was honest," Leon finished. "That was honest." "Yeah." She stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkness. Behind her, she could hear Caleb's breathing, steady and patient. Marriage. To a man she'd known for less than 3 months. A man who'd appeared out of a blizzard and quietly rebuilt her world. A man she trusted but didn't fully understand. A man who was offering her stability and protection and partnership, but maybe not love. Or maybe that's exactly what love looked like when you were past the age of fairy tales and drowning in reality. I need time to think, she said finally. Take all the time you need. How much time are you willing to give me? However much you need, week, month, year, I'm not going anywhere. She turned to face him. You say that now, but what happens when you get tired of waiting? When you decide this isn't worth it? Won't happen. You don't know that. Yes, I do. He stood and crossed to where she was standing. Leanne, I've been alone for 5 years. I know what loneliness feels like. I know what it's like to wake up and realize you've gone 3 days without speaking a word out loud. I know what it's like to consider not waking up at all, just to make it stop. His voice was raw, stripped of its usual control. And then I met you, he continued, and your kids. And for the first time in half a decade, I wanted to get up in the morning, wanted to see what the day would bring, wanted to be useful for something besides keeping cattle alive. So no, I'm not going to get tired of waiting, because waiting for you is still better than any alternative. Leanne's eyes burned. That's not fair. What's not fair? Saying things like that, making me feel... She stopped, unable to finish. Feel what? Like maybe this could work. Like maybe I don't have to do everything alone. Like maybe I deserve something good after all the bad. Caleb's hand came up, cupping her face gently. You do deserve something good. And so do your kids. And if I can be part of that, even a small part, then I count myself lucky. Leanne closed her eyes, leaning into his touch despite every instinct telling her to pull away. This was dangerous. This was trust. This was opening herself up to loss all over again. But it was also warmth. Safety. The possibility of a future that didn't involve fighting every single day just to survive. Ask me again, she whispered. What? Ask me again. Tomorrow. When I've had time to think clearly. All right? He dropped his hand and stepped back. Tomorrow. That night, Leanne lay awake long after Caleb had fallen asleep by the fire. She listened to his breathing mixing with the children's, creating a rhythm of presence that should have been comforting, but instead felt terrifying. Because she knew what her answer would be. She'd known it the moment he'd asked. The next morning, she told him yes, not with some grand speech or dramatic declaration, just a simple yes over breakfast, with the children eating porridge and the morning light streaming through the window he'd fixed. Caleb had looked at her for a long moment, as if making sure he'd heard correctly. Then he'd nodded once and said, All right then. The children had looked between them, confused. What's happening? June asked. Leanne took a breath. Mr. Rourke has asked me to marry him, and I've said yes. Silence. Then chaos. June started crying, though whether from happiness or fear wasn't clear. The twins just stared, too young to really understand, but May looked at her mother with an expression that was far too adult for a 9-year-old. Do you love him? May asked. It was the question Leanne had been avoiding asking herself. I care about him very much, she said carefully. And I trust him. And I think he'll be good to us. To all of us. That's not the same thing. No, it's not. But sometimes it's more important. May considered this, then looked at Caleb. Are you going to be our father? Caleb looked uncomfortable, but he didn't dodge the question. I'd like to be. If you'll let me. Will you leave like our other father did? Your father didn't leave on purpose, May. He had an accident. But he's still gone. And you might be gone too someday. That's true. I might. But I promise you I'll do everything I can to stay alive, and I'll never leave by choice. That's the best promise I can make. May studied him for a long moment. Then she said, Okay, you can marry Mama. Caleb's lips twitched. Appreciate your permission. The wedding itself happened 2 weeks later in the settlement's church with Reverend Matthews presiding. It was small, just them, the children, and a handful of witnesses required by law. No celebration, no party, no white dress or flowers or any of the things that were supposed to make a wedding special. But Leanne didn't care about those things. She cared that when Caleb said, I do, his voice was steady and sure. She cared that when she said it back, she meant it. She cared that the Reverend smiled at them with genuine warmth, even if the witnesses looked disapproving. And she cared that when they walked out of the church as husband and wife, Caleb took her hand in front of everyone and didn't let go. The hostility was still there. Garrett was there with his friends, glaring from across the street. Other townspeople whispered and stared, but there was nothing they could say now. Nothing they could do. It was legal. Official. Done. They loaded into the wagon and headed home, except it wasn't just Lian's home anymore. It was theirs. A blended family built on necessity and trust, and something that might become love if they gave it time. That first night as husband and wife was awkward. They'd been living together for weeks, but this was different. This came with expectations, with rights and obligations that hadn't existed before. After the children were asleep, they stood on opposite sides of the cabin's single room, neither quite sure what to do. "I can still sleep by the fire," Caleb said. "Don't want you to feel pressured. We're married now. That seems silly." "Maybe, but I'm not going to assume anything." Lian appreciated that. Even now, even after everything, he was giving her space to choose. She thought about Wei, about their wedding night, when they'd both been so young and nervous and convinced they knew what they were doing, about all the nights since then, some good, many difficult, all of them part of a life that was over now. This was different. This was a choice she was making with full knowledge of what marriage could be, the good and the bad, the comfort and the compromise. "Come to bed," she said quietly. "It's cold, and there's no point in both of us freezing." They lay down on opposite sides of the mattress, a careful distance between them. The children were bundled on their own mattress across the room, breathing softly in sleep. Lian stared at the ceiling, hyper-aware of Caleb's presence beside her. His warmth, his breathing, the way the mattress dipped slightly under his weight. "Thank you," she said into the darkness. "For what? For not pushing, for giving me time, for understanding that this is complicated." "Lian, I'm not looking for gratitude. I'm just trying to do right by you." "I know, but I'm grateful anyway." They were quiet for a while. Then Caleb said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Do you think you'll ever love me? Really love me, I mean. Not just trust me or care about me, but actually love me?" The question hung in the dark, vulnerable and raw. Lynn thought about it, really thought about it. About the man beside her who'd shown up in a blizzard, who'd fixed her roof and brought food and taught her children to ride, who'd stood up to an entire town on her behalf, who'd offered her everything he had without asking for anything in return except a chance. "I think I might already," she said softly. "I'm just scared to admit it." She felt him shift beside her, moving closer. His hand found hers in the darkness, fingers intertwining. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." And for the first time in months, maybe years, Lian felt something that wasn't fear or grief or exhaustion. She felt hope. Real, dangerous, terrifying hope. And she let herself hold on to it. The trouble came exactly 3 weeks after the wedding, on a Thursday morning when the sky was the color of old bruises and the wind carried the smell of coming rain. Lian was in the garden checking on the winter wheat seedlings when she heard horses approaching. Not Caleb's steady single-horse rhythm, but multiple animals moving fast. She straightened up, dirt on her hands and knees, and felt her stomach drop. 4 riders. Thomas Garrett in front, flanked by 3 men she recognized from the settlement. They pulled up about 20 yards from the cabin, close enough to make their presence felt, but far enough to claim they weren't trespassing. The children were inside with Caleb, who'd stayed home that morning to repair a section of fence. Lian walked toward the riders slowly, keeping her face neutral even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "Mrs. Rourke," Garrett said, putting emphasis on the name like it was something dirty. "Or should I still call you Mrs. Joe?" Hard to keep track. "What do you want, Garrett?" "Just being neighborly, checking in on you and your new husband." His eyes swept over the property, taking in the repaired buildings, the healthy chickens, the signs of prosperity that hadn't been there 6 months ago. "Heard Caleb moved in. That true?" "We're married, so yes, he lives here." "Interesting. Because I also heard he's been letting his own ranch go to hell. Cattle wandering, fences down, place falling apart." Garrett smiled, and it wasn't friendly. Makes a man wonder about priorities. "My husband's priorities are none of your business." See, that's where you're wrong. When a man abandons his responsibilities to play house with a... He caught himself, glancing at his friends. "Well, let's just say the community has concerns." The door to the cabin opened and Caleb stepped out. He didn't hurry, didn't show alarm, just walked over to stand beside Lian with that same solid presence that made her feel like maybe the world wasn't entirely hostile. "Garrett," he said flatly, "you got something to say to me? Say it. Already said it to your wife. But since you're here, yeah, I got questions. Like why you're letting your ranch fall apart. Like whether you're planning to actually work your land or just live off her government section." My ranch is fine. Hired a hand to manage it while I'm here. It was a lie. Leon knew it was a lie because they'd talked about it just last night, about how Caleb was stretched too thin trying to maintain both properties, about how something was going to have to give. But his voice didn't waver, and Garrett had no way to prove otherwise. That's so. Funny, because I rode past there yesterday and didn't see anyone. Then you weren't looking very hard. Garrett's jaw tightened. You know what I think? I think you've lost your mind. I think you've thrown away everything your father built for a piece of tail that... Caleb moved so fast, Lion barely saw it. 1 second he was standing beside her, the next he had Garrett by the shirt and was dragging him off his horse. Garrett hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. The other 3 riders reached for their weapons, but Caleb already had his rifle out. He must have grabbed it from inside the cabin, and it was pointed directly at the nearest man. First person draws gets shot, Caleb said calmly. That clear enough? Nobody moved. Caleb looked down at Garrett, who was struggling to breathe. You're going to get on your horse and leave, and you're not coming back. Not ever. You got business with me, you come to my ranch. You come here again, I'll assume you're trespassing with hostile intent and act accordingly. You can't, Garrett wheezed. I can. This is private property. You're not welcome. Leave. Garrett climbed slowly to his feet, his face red with humiliation and rage. He mounted his horse with jerky movements, never taking his eyes off Caleb. This isn't over, he said. Yeah, it is. You just don't know it yet. Garrett and his friends rode off, kicking up mud as they went. Leon watched until they disappeared over the rise, then turned to Caleb. You shouldn't have done that. Probably not. He's going to make trouble. He was already making trouble. At least now he knows where I stand. Caleb, I'm not going to let him talk about you like that. I don't care who he is or who his father is. There's a line, and he crossed it. Leon wanted to argue, wanted to say that violence only made things worse, that they needed to be smarter than this, that antagonizing the settlement's most influential families was suicide. But she was also tired. Tired of being afraid. Tired of backing down. Tired of letting other people's hatred dictate how she lived. All right, she said finally, but we need to be careful now. He's not going to let this go. I know. That night, Caleb didn't go to sleep. He sat at the table cleaning his rifle, checking the ammunition, making sure everything was in order. Leon watched him from the bed, the children asleep around her. You think he'll come back? She asked quietly. Maybe. Probably not tonight, but soon. What are we going to do? Same thing we've been doing. Live our lives, protect our family, not back down. That's not a plan. It's the only plan we've got. He was right, and that scared her more than Garrett's threats, because they were outnumbered and isolated and completely dependent on Caleb's willingness to fight, and fighting could only end one way. 3 days passed, then 4. Nothing happened. Lion started to relax, started to think maybe Garrett had decided the confrontation wasn't worth pursuing. Maybe his father had talked sense into him. Maybe he'd found some other target for his anger. She should have known better. On the 5th day, Caleb rode over to his ranch to check on things. He'd been putting it off, but the guilt was eating at him. That land had been his father's legacy, and letting it deteriorate felt like betrayal. He left early, promising to be back by nightfall. Leon spent the morning doing laundry and helping the children with their lessons. May was teaching the twins their letters while June practiced his numbers. It was peaceful, normal, the kind of day that made her think maybe they could build something lasting here. Then, around midday, she saw the smoke. It was rising from the direction of Caleb's ranch, a thick black column that stained the sky. Leon's blood went cold. May, she said, trying to keep her voice steady, take your brothers and sisters inside. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me or Caleb. Understand? May's eyes went wide, but she nodded and started gathering the children. Leon ran to the barn, saddled Sam with shaking hands, and rode toward the smoke as fast as the horse could carry her. The ride took 20 minutes that felt like hours. The smoke got thicker as she approached, and by the time she crested the final hill, she could see flames. Caleb's barn was burning. The main house looked intact, but the barn, where he kept his tools, his winter hay, his entire livelihood, was fully engulfed. Orange flames reached toward the sky, sending up sparks that threatened to spread to the other buildings. Caleb was there, along with another man Leon didn't recognize, probably the hand he'd supposedly hired. They were trying to move the cattle away from the fire, but it was chaos. The animals were panicked, scattering in every direction. Lion rode down to help, sliding off Sam and immediately grabbing a bucket. There was a well nearby, and she started hauling water, even though she knew it was useless. The barn was already lost. They were just trying to keep the fire from spreading. Caleb saw her, and his face went hard with something that might have been anger or fear or both. "What are you doing here?" He shouted over the roar of the flames. "Helping! You should be with the kids. May's with them. They're safe." There wasn't time to argue. They worked side by side, throwing water on the edges of the fire, creating barriers to stop its spread. The heat was intense, making the air shimmer and hard to breathe. Leon's eyes streamed tears from the smoke. It took 3 hours to get the fire under control. By then, the barn was nothing but charred timbers and ash. The house had survived, barely. Some of the fencing was gone. The cattle were scattered across 3 miles of open range. Caleb stood looking at the destruction, his face black with soot and completely empty of expression. "This was Garrett," Leon said. It wasn't a question. "Probably. Can't prove it." "We should go to the sheriff." "And say what? That I suspect someone set a fire but have no evidence? That won't do anything except make us look weak." The other man, whose name turned out to be Peter, a drifter Caleb had hired a week ago, cleared his throat. "For what it's worth, I saw riders this morning. 3 of them. Didn't get close enough to identify them, but they were watching the place." "Which direction did they come from?" Caleb asked. "East. From the settlement." Caleb nodded slowly, something dangerous settling into his eyes. "All right, thank you, Peter. Take the rest of the day. I'll pay you for the full week." Peter looked like he wanted to argue, but thought better of it. He collected his things and left, glancing back once at the smoking ruins. When they were alone, Leon touched Caleb's arm. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I'm done being patient. Caleb, they burned my barn, Leon. Destroyed a season's worth of hay and tools. Could have killed the livestock. Could have spread to the house and killed Peter. This isn't harassment anymore. It's attempted murder." "So what are you going to do?" He looked at her, and she saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. Something cold and determined that made her realize she didn't know him as well as she thought. "I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen again," he said. They rode back to the cabin in silence, arriving just before dark. The children ran out to meet them, relieved and frightened by their long absence. Caleb dismounted and hugged each of them briefly, still awkward with affection but trying, then went inside. Leon followed, leaving the children outside to play. Caleb was at the table, writing something. She moved closer and saw it was a letter. "What's that?" "Letter to my cousin in Denver. He's a lawyer. I'm asking him about our legal options." "Legal options for what?" "For pressing charges, for getting protection, for making sure that what happened today doesn't happen here." He finished writing, sealed the envelope, and set it aside. Then he looked at her with exhausted eyes. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what?" "For bringing this trouble to your door. If I hadn't married you, if I just helped and then walked away, Garrett wouldn't have a target. You'd be safe." Leon sat down across from him. "Stop. We made this choice together, and I'm not sorry. Even with all of this, I'm not sorry." "You should be." "Maybe, but I'm not." She reached across and took his hand. "We're in this together. That's what marriage means, for better or worse. And right now it's worse, but we'll figure it out." "How?" "I don't know yet, but we will." It sounded naive even to her own ears. But what else could they do? Give up? Run? Let Garrett win? No. They'd survived too much to quit now. The next morning, Caleb rode into the settlement alone. Leon had wanted to go with him, but he'd refused. "This is my fight," he'd said, "and I need you here protecting the children." He'd taken his rifle and his letter and ridden away before she could argue further. Leanne spent the day in a state of nervous energy, unable to focus on anything. She started tasks and abandoned them halfway through. The children picked up on her anxiety and became fractious, fighting with each other over nothing. By the time Caleb returned late that afternoon, Leon was ready to climb the walls. He looked tired but not defeated. That was something. "What happened?" she asked as he dismounted. "Went to the sheriff first, filed a report about the fire. He took notes, said he'd look into it, but we both know he won't do anything." "And then?" "Then I went to Garrett's ranch." Leanne's heart stopped. "Caleb? Didn't shoot him, if that's what you're worried about. Just had a conversation, man to man. Made it clear that if anything else happens to our property or our family, I'll consider it a declaration of war, and I'll respond accordingly." "What did he say?" "Not much. But he heard me. And his father was there, heard it too. Old man Garrett's not stupid. He knows this is getting out of hand. I think he'll rein his son in." "You think? You don't know. No, I don't know, but it's the best I could do without actually killing someone. Leon wanted to be angry at him for taking such a risk, but looking at his face, at the exhaustion and determination written there, she couldn't find the anger. Only fear and love tangled together in a way that made her chest ache. Come inside, she said. Eat something. Rest. In a minute. I need to check the perimeter first. Make sure nobody followed me back. He did a slow circuit to the property while Leon started dinner. When he finally came inside, the children mobbed him with questions and concerns. He answered them patiently, simplified versions of the truth that wouldn't give them nightmares. That night, they lay in bed side by side, both too wired to sleep. I sold it, Caleb said into the darkness. Sold what? My father's watch. The one thing of value I had. Sold it in December to buy food for your family. Leon turned to look at him. Why are you telling me this now? Because I want you to understand. I gave up the last piece of my father for you and your children. Not because I expected anything in return. Not because I thought it would buy your affection, but because watching you suffer was unbearable, and I had the power to stop it. His voice was rough with emotion. That watch was worth more than money, he continued. It was memory, legacy. The only thing I had that proved I came from somewhere, that I wasn't just some drifter living alone on the frontier, and I sold it without hesitation because you mattered more. Leon felt tears sliding down her face. Why didn't you tell me? Because it wasn't about gratitude. It was about doing what was right. And if I'd told you, you would have tried to pay me back or felt like you owed me something, and I didn't want that. I just wanted you to survive. She rolled toward him, pressing her face against his shoulder. I love you. The words came out before she could stop them, raw and honest and terrifying. Caleb went very still. You don't have to say that. I'm not saying it because I have to. I'm saying it because it's true. I love you, Caleb Rourke. And I don't care if it's too soon or if it doesn't make sense or if the whole world thinks I'm crazy. I love you. His arms came around her, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. I love you too, he whispered against her hair. From the moment I saw you standing at that window, starving and defiant and refusing to break. I loved you then, and I love you now, and I'll love you until I stop breathing. They held each other in the darkness, two broken people who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances and somehow made it work. And for the first time since Wei died, Leon felt completely certain of something. This was right. This was real. This was worth fighting for. 2 weeks passed without incident, then a month. Spring arrived in earnest, bringing green grass and wildflowers, and the kind of weather that made hard work almost pleasant. Caleb rebuilt his barn using lumber he'd stockpiled and labor he traded for with neighboring ranchers who weren't part of Garrett's circle. It wasn't as big as the original, but it was functional. The cattle were rounded up, the ranch started producing again, and slowly, carefully, they built a routine that spanned both properties. Caleb would spend 3 days at his ranch, 3 days at the cabin, and 1 day traveling between them. It wasn't perfect. Leon missed him when he was gone, and the children asked for him constantly, but it worked. More importantly, the hostility from the settlement began to ease. Not disappear, it would never fully disappear, but soften. People still stared, still whispered, but they stopped actively interfering. The Reverend continued to welcome them at services, and a few other families started acknowledging them with cautious nods. It wasn't acceptance, but it was coexistence, and that was enough. One day in late April, Leanne was working in the garden when she saw a wagon approaching. She tensed automatically, but relaxed when she recognized Ellen Marsh driving it. Ellen had been one of the few friendly faces in the settlement before isolation set in. She pulled up near the cabin and climbed down, holding a basket. Mrs. Rourke, she said carefully, hope I'm not intruding. Not at all. What brings you out here? Wanted to apologize, actually, for how we all treated you after your husband died. It wasn't right, and I've been feeling guilty about it for months. Leanne didn't know what to say. The apology felt both too late and exactly what she needed to hear. I appreciate that, she said finally. Ellen nodded, then held out the basket. Brought some preserves and some seeds for your garden. Thought you might be able to use them. Thank you. They stood there awkwardly for a moment. Then Ellen said, Truth is, watching you and Caleb stand up to Garrett, it made a lot of us realize we'd been cowards, letting him and his friends dictate who was welcome and who wasn't. Some of the women have been talking, and we want you to know that you're not alone anymore. If you need anything at all, you can come to us. Leon's throat went tight. I don't know what to say. Don't have to say anything. Just know it's true. Ellen left shortly after, but her words stayed with Leon all day. She told Caleb about it that evening, and he smiled in that small way he had. "Told you people would come around," he said. "You did not. You said we'd have to fight them tooth and nail." "Did I?" Must have been feeling pessimistic that day. She hit him with a dish towel, and he laughed, catching her around the waist and pulling her close. The children groaned in exaggerated disgust, but they were smiling too. This was what normal looked like, Leon thought. Not perfect, not without struggle, but real and solid and built on choice rather than desperation. Summer brought its own challenges. The drought that had killed Way's crops threatened to return, but Caleb knew irrigation techniques from his years of ranching. He showed Leon how to channel water from the creek, how to mulch the soil to retain moisture, how to plant in ways that protected the seedlings from the brutal sun. The garden flourished. The wheat came in strong. The chickens laid eggs faster than they could eat them, so Leon started selling the surplus in town. The money wasn't much, but it was theirs, earned, independent. June turned 7 and started helping with the heavy work, determined to prove he was growing up. The twins became inseparable from the barn cats, dragging them around like dolls. May grew quieter and more thoughtful, often found reading under the tree Caleb had planted near the cabin. And Leon learned what it felt like to be happy. Not constantly. There were still hard days, still moments when grief hit her like a wave, but more often than not, she woke up grateful for the life they'd built. In late July, Caleb came back from town with unexpected news. "Garrett's leaving," he said. Leon looked up from the bread she was kneading. "What?" "His father's sending him to work on a ranch in Montana. Apparently the old man decided his son needed to learn responsibility somewhere far away from his friends and his bad habits." "For how long?" "Indefinitely. Might be gone for years." Leon set down the dough, processing this. "Does this mean it's over?" "Maybe. Probably. At least for now." She should have felt relief. Triumph, even. But all she felt was tired. Tired of conflict. Tired of having to fight for the simple right to exist. "Good," she said finally. "Let him go. Let him learn something. Let him become someone different." Caleb crossed to where she stood and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You're too kind for your own good." "I'm not kind. I'm just tired of hating people. It takes too much energy." He laughed softly. "Fair enough." They stood there for a while, watching through the window as the children played in the yard. June was teaching the twins some game with sticks. May was reading aloud to anyone who would listen. "We did it," Leon said quietly. "We actually did it." "Did what?" "Survived. Built something. Made it work when everyone said it was impossible." "We did. Together." "Together," she agreed. That winter was easier than the last. They had plenty of food stored, plenty of firewood, and most importantly, plenty of each other. Caleb's ranch was fully functional again, producing enough income to support both properties. Leanne's garden had been successful enough that she'd preserved vegetables for months. The children were healthy and growing like weeds. On Christmas morning, exactly 1 year after Caleb had first appeared through the blizzard, Leanne woke up to find him watching her. "What?" she asked sleepily. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how different this is from last year, how close we all came to not making it." Leanne thought about that Christmas. The hunger, the cold, the desperation. The moment she'd looked at her children and realized she had nothing left to give them. And then Caleb had appeared, a stranger with no agenda except basic human decency. And everything had changed. "We made it," she said. "Against all odds, we made it. We did." He paused. "I'm going to ask you something, and you can say no." "All right." "I want to adopt the children, legally make them mine. So if anything ever happens to you, there's no question about who takes care of them, so they have the protection of my name and my legacy." Leanne felt her eyes fill with tears. "Caleb, you don't have to answer now. Think about it. Talk to the kids. But I want you to know that I think of them as mine already. Have for months, and I want it to be official." She didn't need to think about it. "Yes." "Yes?" "Yes. They're already yours in every way that matters. Making it legal is just acknowledging what's already true." His smile was brilliant and rare and beautiful. "All right then." They told the children that morning over breakfast. June whooped with excitement. The twins didn't fully understand but seemed pleased. And May looked at Caleb with tears in her eyes and said, "Can I call you Papa?" Caleb's voice was rough when he answered, "I'd like that very much." The legal adoption took 3 months to finalize, but when it was done, they were officially a family. Not blended, not assembled from broken pieces, just a family. Spring came again, bringing with it the promise of renewal. The winter wheat they'd planted was coming up strong. The garden was already planned and partially seeded. The livestock were healthy. And Leanne was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but hadn't been sure until the doctor in the settlement confirmed it. She was terrified and thrilled in equal measure, her emotions swinging wildly between joy and panic. When she told Caleb, he sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "You're sure?" he asked. "The doctor's sure, I'm sure. We're having a baby." A baby. He said it like he was testing out a foreign word. Then his face split into a grin so wide it transformed him completely. "We're having a baby. You're happy about this?" "Happy. Leanne, He stood up and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. "I'm terrified and thrilled and completely unprepared, and yes, absolutely happy." The children were predictably excited. June immediately wanted to know if it would be a boy, so he'd have someone to play with. The twins wanted a sister. May just smiled and said she'd help however she could. The pregnancy was hard. Leanne was older now than she'd been with the others, and her body reminded her of that fact daily. But Caleb was attentive and patient, taking over tasks she couldn't manage, making sure she rested, worrying constantly. In late October, on a cool morning when the leaves were just starting to turn, Leanne went into labor. The birth was long and difficult. Caleb stayed with her the whole time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement, even when she screamed at him to shut up. Ellen Marsh came to help with the delivery, along with 2 other women from the settlement who'd slowly become friends. And finally, after 14 hours of labor, a baby's cry filled the cabin. "It's a girl," Ellen announced, placing the tiny red-faced infant on Leanne's chest. Leanne looked down at her daughter, their daughter, and felt something shift in her chest. This baby represented everything they'd fought for, everything they'd built, the future they'd made possible by refusing to give up. Caleb leaned over them both, his eyes wet. "She's perfect." "She's loud," Leanne corrected, but she was smiling. "What should we name her?" Leanne had thought about this. Hope. Hope, because that's what she is. That's what all of this is. We survived by hoping when there was nothing to hope for. And now we have everything. Caleb kissed her forehead gently. "Hope it is." The children came in one by one to meet their new sister. June was awed into silence. The twins wanted to touch her tiny fingers. May held her with surprising confidence and whispered something Leanne couldn't quite hear. And Leanne looked around at her family, this strange, assembled, hard-won family, and realized something fundamental. She'd spent so long focused on survival that she'd forgotten what living actually meant. She'd been so afraid of losing things that she'd stopped trying to gain them. She'd let grief and fear wall her off from the world. But Caleb had shown her something different. He'd shown her that survival wasn't the opposite of living. It was the foundation of it. That you could endure terrible things and still build something beautiful. That choosing hope over despair wasn't naive. It was the bravest thing a person could do. They hadn't just survived the wilderness, they'd redefined it, turned a place of isolation and hardship into a home, turned rejection into chosen family, turned loss into new beginnings. And they'd done it by refusing to accept the world's verdict on what was possible. 5 years later, Leanne stood on the porch of their expanded cabin and looked out over land that had finally started to cooperate. The garden was lush, the livestock healthy. The barn, rebuilt and better than before, stood solid against the horizon. Hope was 5 now, running around with the chickens and shrieking with laughter. The twins were 9 and absolutely feral in the best way. June was 12 and already as tall as Leanne, his father's eyes but Caleb's steady temperament. May was 14, helping Caleb with the books, and already talking about becoming a teacher. They'd added on to this cabin twice, turning it from a struggling homestead into a proper ranch house. They'd hired 2 hands to help with the work. They'd become respected members of the community, not just tolerated, but valued. Ellen Marsh had become one of Leanne's closest friends. The Reverend visited regularly. Even some of the families who'd been most hostile had come around, their children playing with Leanne's without any concern for where they'd come from. Garrett had never returned from Montana. Last they'd heard, he'd married a rancher's daughter and was building his own life far from the settlement's judgment. Caleb came up behind her, sliding his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything. Nothing. How different this is from what I expected." Better or worse? Better. Definitely better. She leaned back against him. Do you ever regret it? Giving up your solitude, taking on all of this chaos? Every single day, he said, deadpan. Then he laughed when she elbowed him. No, never. Not once. Even when Jean broke your favorite axe? Even then. Even when the twins released all the chickens and we had to spend 3 hours catching them? Especially then. That was hilarious. Leon laughed, and the sound felt natural now. Easy, like something she'd been born knowing how to do. I love you, she said. I love you too. They stood there watching their children play, watching the sun set over land they'd fought for and won. And Leon thought about the story they'd tell someday. It wouldn't be a story about rescue, about a man saving a woman from certain death. It would be a story about choice, about two people who'd been rejected by the world deciding they didn't need the world's approval, about building something new when everything old had burned down. It would be a story about survival, yes, but more than that, it would be a story about what came after survival, about the courage it took to trust again, to love again, to hope again when hope had failed you before, because that was the real lesson Leon had learned. Survival wasn't enough. You had to decide what you were surviving for. You had to choose to live instead of just existing. You had to believe that tomorrow could be better than today, even when all the evidence suggested otherwise. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, you found someone who was willing to believe it with you. Someone who showed up in a blizzard with supplies and stayed long enough to become home. Someone who taught you that the wilderness wasn't just a place, it was a test. And passing that test didn't mean conquering it. It meant learning to live within it, to find beauty in harsh landscapes, to build families from strangers, to make home wherever you decided to plant your roots. Caleb squeezed her gently. Dinner's almost ready. Should we call them in? In a minute. Let them play a little longer. So they stood there together, watching their children run and laugh and grow, and Lan felt something she'd once thought impossible. She felt content. Not because everything was perfect. It wasn't. There were still hard days, still conflicts, still moments when the past rose up and reminded her of everything she'd lost. But there was also this: warmth and laughter and family, land that produced, work that mattered, love that had been chosen deliberately instead of fallen into blindly. And maybe that was what happy endings really looked like. Not perfection, not the absence of struggle, just the presence of something worth struggling for. All right, she said finally, let's call them in. They walked toward the house together, hand in hand, their voices mingling with their children's as they called everyone to dinner. And behind them, the sun set over the wilderness they'd transformed from enemy to ally, painting the sky in colors that promised tomorrow would come. And they would be ready for it, together.